Okay, so Furquim is... All right, so good afternoon, good morning or good night, depending on, good evening actually, depending on where you are now. We are here for another panel of this third international conference on competition and innovation hosted by IBCI. And I'm really delighted to share this panel with so remarkable professors, starting from John Newman, Associate Professor, University of Miami School of Law. Then Paulo Furquim, Professor and Coordinator of the Center for Regulation and Democracy at INSPER. Professor Roberto Pfeiffer, Professor of the Faculty of Law of University of São Paulo. And Professor Rory, if I'm not wrong, Rory is Professor at Boston College, Boston University, right, Professor Rory? All right. So going straight forward to what we want and you want to hear, I pass the floor to Professor John. Please, Professor John, the word is yours.
All right, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to take just a minute to queue up some slides. Okay. Let's see. Can everybody see that okay? Yes, good. All right, so can I do an actual slideshow? Yes, all right. So I'm super excited to talk about this topic. It's one that's been on my mind for quite a while. And it's one that is, of course, in the news very much of late. Most recently, yesterday, when the US Federal Trade Commission and a bunch of states announced that they were filing an antitrust lawsuit against Facebook, which operates in an attention market. So I think an important topic, it's one that I used to have to explain why it was important, but I think everybody's on board with knowing it's important. So this paper is really less a pitch for us to pay attention to attention markets and more me trying to wrestle around with how we might actually apply antitrust or competition law in attention markets. And our roadmap for today, I want to try to hit all these topics. We'll be moving somewhat quickly, but I think we'll be able to cover all of this. I want to make first a point that these are not the American Express style, the famous US two-sided platform case. I want to argue that these attention markets should not be treated as two-sided platforms in an antitrust case. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of a barter exchange, which is unusual, not something we think about a lot in antitrust law or economics. I want to debunk a fallacy, the massive market fallacy, I call it. I'll talk a little bit about what kinds of harm we should be looking for in these markets. I want to make a pitch that attention is much more important than big data and privacy, maybe a little controversial. And then finally, maybe even more controversially, I think we should allow some cartel type activity, some interfirm coordination type activity in these attention markets. So first off, these are not Amex style two-sided platforms, or at least they shouldn't be treated that way in an antitrust case. Why not? Well, people often, somewhat offhandedly, will claim that, oh, Facebook is a two-sided market, right? It's a two-sided platform. And so it doesn't look like a traditional antitrust type market. It's a sideways type market where Facebook brings together different customers or trading partners, users on the one hand, and then advertisers, like say a car company, BMW, on the other hand. I want to argue that this is not the best way to think about these markets. And here's a traditional market, right? The market for cars, where BMW is selling a physical product. We usually think of these as these top-down distribution systems, a three-part system with a producer at the top, a distributor in the middle, and then a consumer at the bottom. And these are much more straightforward. We're more familiar with applying antitrust or competition law to these markets. Why? Well, I say this is the unique thing about these markets. You can trace the same product all the way through the distribution chain, starting at one end and going to the other. So I call this the product tracing test. Wherever you can trace a product all the way from the producer to the final consumer, you've got a normal market. We don't need to do any bizarre two-sided analysis. if you've got a normal market. So this is the product tracing test. And you can apply this test to the payment network context, which is what was at issue in the American Express case. That was credit card payments. And in this context, you can't apply the product tracing test. Instead, you've got these two different products, right? Ability to accept a payment is different from ability to make a payment. So you can't trace the product all the way through. Instead, you really kind of do seem to have this unique thing in the middle that's providing two different products to two different people. I can't apply my product tracing test, so that is maybe a two-sided market. Well, then my question is, in the present context, how does Facebook fare under my product tracing test? Well, people used to not really be sure how Facebook made money. They knew that Facebook sold ads, but they didn't know what exactly was going on the user end of things. Now I think we have a pretty good sense that users trade attention in order to get access to Facebook. Okay, so if the product of interest is attention, I can actually trace that all the way from the producer through Facebook to the consumer. In other words, it's like the old car market. It's not like the payment card network market that required maybe some different analysis. Instead, it looks just like this. It's very familiar, top-down distribution, satisfies my product tracing test. So we can apply our familiar toolkit to some extent at least. All right, what is unique about these? Well, there are some unique things about attention markets. In particular, attention markets often, though not always, involve a barter exchange, right? And I should say they always involve a barter exchange. They often involve a pure barter exchange where no money changes hands, right? And in particular, that's on the user end of things. Well, how does that complicate things? I say it doesn't complicate things as much as you might think. People get really hung up on who the consumers are in a Facebook type context and who the producers are. It is a little confusing because you have two producers and two consumers, right? Two sets of producers and two sets of consumers. But you could treat people as the producers, and you could say this is a market for attention to social networking. Or you could say Facebook is the producer and treat it as a market for social networking. Okay? But this doesn't really change the analysis. Now, if you're worried about advertisers, that means you should probably orient this a certain way. But if you're worried about users, you could really situate them as producers or consumers. They can be harmed either way. This, though, does, I think, lead some people to fall into a trap. And they say, well, if this could be a market for attention, then everything on the internet is competing for my attention, right? Reddit, Google+, which is, I think, gone now. Twitter, Flickr, et cetera, they all compete for attention. So this must be one giant relevant market. And if it's a giant relevant market, Facebook doesn't look so big anymore. Even if they have Instagram too, even if they have WhatsApp as well. This is wrong though, right? If you carry this to its logical extreme, the market would also include sporting events, right? Football games, a crying child nearby, a beautiful sunset, right? They all compete for our attention. And if you think I'm just setting up a straw man so I can knock it down, let's throw beautiful people in there too, by the way. It's really not. People have actually made this argument. Oh, this is one relevant market that includes beautiful sunsets or watching YouTube. It's just ridiculous, I think, because we know in the antitrust or competition community, the relevant market doesn't include all substitutes. It includes all reasonable substitutes. So the question is not what competes for attention. It's, if I've got a potential market here, let's call it the social networking market. Is a beautiful sunset a reasonable substitute for social networking? Is looking at a beautiful person a reasonable substitute for social networking? I think the answer is going to be no. Now, there are some kind of complicated ways you can go about defining the antitrust relevant market, but I want to make the more basic point that it doesn't necessarily include everything that competes for attention. All right, okay, so let's say we know how to define a market. What types of antitrust harm should we be looking for in these markets? Some of the types of harm are pretty familiar. Harm to innovation. We know how to do that, more or less. We did it in Microsoft 20 years ago. higher prices to advertisers. That's a very familiar harm. The unique one, I think, has to do with our attention, right? You can think of the harm that could occur having to do with our attention, either as a higher attention cost, right? More ads are being jammed down my throat, and so I'm having to expend more attention in a way I don't want to. Or you could say, well, Facebook's delivering a lower quality product, or Google is delivering a lower quality product. Now, the Justice Department, the US Justice Department, in its case against Google, talked about lower quality. The FTC and the states both talked about lower quality. They say more ads or less privacy means lower quality. I actually prefer the higher cost sort of framing. It's the same thing. It's two sides of the same coin. But I like the higher cost framing, a higher attention cost or a higher information cost. Why do I like that? Well, it's just a more comfortable framing. I can put in front of a judge this classic diagram that we all saw on the first day of antitrust class or Economics 101. And it's just much more comfortable, even if it's the same thing as lower quality, effectively. I think framing the harm as a higher attention cost or a higher information cost rather than lower quality, I think is just much more comfortable. It's going to allow a judge in an unfamiliar context, because these markets are new to some extent, to have a kind of a comfortable way to think about the potential harm here. All right, now that said, I prefer attention harm to data harm. I think attention is more important. It's more worthy of our attention as compared to data and privacy issues. So a lot of people seem to have this view that a company like Facebook's business model basically involves like selling data to advertisers. Right? They're all about getting our data. They're all about eroding our privacy so they can sell that to companies like BMW, advertisers, right? My question is, if that's the business model, like why? Why would BMW just want to know the things that I'm clicking on online, right? Are they just a bunch of like evil supervillains in their corporate headquarters? And once they find out that John Newman, has been like messaging his ex-girlfriend or something, that they cackle, now they know my secrets. No, of course not, right? BMW executives are not just evil people who want to know everything. They want attention. They want eyeballs on their advertisements so that I subsequently buy a car. Now, Facebook uses data as an input to better slice up those eyeballs and sell them in little targeted chunks. But that demand is just derived from the primary demand, which is for attention, right? So what that tells me as an analyst is I should pay more attention to attention. Data is not irrelevant. It can be important, right? There is demand for data, but it's derived demand, as an economist would put it. So if we focus so much on data and privacy, we're going to miss the forest for the trees. So this is why BMW wants my attention, right? It's why Facebook wants my attention and to some extent my data, because they know if I click on a BMW review, I might be susceptible to all these ads. All right, so one takeaway for all of us, I think, is up until today, I had never been at any kind of panel or conference or anything that had any kind of focus on attention, right? So, and I've been to a lot of conferences and been on a lot of panels and seen a lot of talks that talked about big data. So what that tells me then is we've been spending too much time talking about data and privacy and big data and not nearly enough talking about attention. So this is a nice start. Hopefully the first of many to come. All right, my final claim has to do with inter-firm coordination, the kind of thing we often talk about as cartel activity, horizontal agreements among competitors. And I argue that in this context, in the context of attention markets, some of this coordination or cooperation or cartel activity, if you want to call it that, could actually be good and should be treated with some leniency by antitrust and competition enforcers. The starting point for making that claim is that attention is scarce. it can be degraded, right? If your attention is either overwhelmed over time, you run out of gas, right? Or your attention is overwhelmed at a given point in time, the engine overheats. You become a less good version of yourself. You become a bad version of yourself. And we've all experienced that when you have a lot of things bombarding your attention. And then say your spouse or your significant other or your child asks a question and you snap at them, right? Why did you do that? Well, you've just exhibited a problem that can occur because of scarce attention. Now, worse yet, there's pretty good evidence that suggests when your attention gets overloaded and degraded, you can exhibit more pronounced gender biases, racial biases. You make poorer consumption decisions in general. So there's a lot of problems that can happen if we expend too much attention. Well, attention markets lead to this weird sort of failure I posit in the paper. And the failure has to do with over expenditure and overconsumption of attention. How do we get there? Well, normal transactions, you can think of them in a pretty straightforward way. BMW sells people cars, McDonald's sells people cheeseburgers. They don't really have much to do with each other. You can isolate those two markets and look at them separately. But attention markets can lead to some weird feedback effects, right? So what happens when Facebook bombards me with all those BMW ads? And Facebook has this strong incentive to keep me on their platform, right? Maybe longer than I should be, in order to put me in this state. Now, when McDonald's looks at me in that state, they're pretty happy because I might be in exactly the state they want me in, right? So you have another company, Instagram. Prior to this merger or this acquisition, you had competition for McDonald's and Carl's Jr. and other restaurants to bombard me with advertisements. So what just happened there was that there's a kind of an externality, right? A kind of a positive spillover from these companies' perspective. If I get my attention all degraded on Facebook, Instagram might be happy and TikTok might be happy and Twitter might actually be happy about that. And in particular, I think advertisers might not be mad if one advertiser consumes a bunch of attention, puts me in a degraded mental state, makes me vulnerable to the second advertiser. So you get this weird feedback loop of competition. And it could result in me making a suboptimal purchasing decision at the advertiser. It might lead to me walking into a different business and making a suboptimal purchase decision. I don't really need the ice cream, but in this mental state, I don't have the willpower to say no. And like we said at the outset, it can put you in a state where you exhibit more pronounced racial, gender, and other biases. And, just anecdotally, anybody who's been on, Facebook or Twitter has probably seen something that might back up this story, right? So this is a problem. It's a societal problem. How can we address it? Well, there's actually some precedent, some history in the US of attention intermediaries coordinating to stop this, to say we need to stop selling so many advertisements. We need to stop extracting so much attention. And the US Justice Department saw that back in the 70s and said, oh, that's a cartel. And they sued this National Association of Broadcasters. My take, though, is that this reduction in quantity downstream actually might be good, right? This might have some positive societal effects. So DOJ said this is illegal per se. I don't think that's appropriate, right? I think courts should apply at least the rule of reason. And I think the DOJ should use some prosecutorial discretion. If you see something like this, at the very least, it's like, this is not the biggest problem we have to worry about in competition law communities. So with that, I want to thank you all for your attention, and I'll pass the mic back.
Okay, John. Terrific presentation. Very interesting. Very clever. So, not taking a long time, please, Paulo. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Eduardo, and also I'd like to thank Vinicius Klein for the kind invitation, for having me here. It's a pleasure to share this session with John, Rory, and my dear friend Roberto. And also, I liked very much John's presentation. I think you see that actually we have not coordinated what exactly we are going to say. So taking the last point of John, so maybe there is this like inter-firm coordination, maybe the inter-speaker coordination. And you see that we have some differences. So I will be more traditional in way of classifying Facebook as a multi-sided platform, but several complementarities. So John talked about antitrust. I will talk more about the strategy and implications to regulation, and some overlap at the end. I think we are quite in the same boat. I mean, in this this conclusion that maybe we have too much competition for attention, and this is harmful for society. So I also share my presentation. And I will focus here in the more this side of economics and strategy, and then implications to regulation. So my roadmap is the following. So first, attention as a way of creating value, how attention interacts with the strategies of creation value. And then I will go back some decades and see if what is new exactly. And the reason is that we are talking here a new competition drive. And third, then we go to more deeper in this idea of a platform as a way of creating value using attention. And I will conclude with things that I think are more controversial. So this idea of the private and social value creation, and also I will try to link this with specific regulation to tech giants. And so let's see what we have ahead. First, I'm taking here the title of the session. So attention as a new competition drive. And so it's like it's bold here in capital letters, the new. So the question is really a new idea, and not really. I think we have things that are quite new, but not the idea. And I don't know if you know this guy. This guy is Herbert Simon, and he is known among economists as a Nobel Prize winner in 1778. But talking with some colleagues in engineering and computer science, I was once surprised to see that Herbert Simon for them is a computer scientist, actually, not an economist. They didn't know that Herbert Simon was an economist. And he won the Turing Prize in 1975 for his contribution to artificial intelligence and also to computer science. And he, in a conference in the 60s, someone in the audience made these questions to Herbert Simon. So what would be the most important scarcity of the 21st century? And at that time, people were concerned about environment, so the natural resources, so the problem of the oil that could vanish. And he answered, attention. So it was like 60 years ago, he said that. And why he said that? Because he was studying. One of his most important contribution was the bounded rationality, so limits to cognition, that people did not have or don't have this unbounded rationality that economics were using. And also the problem that he anticipated of information overload. So he anticipated that digitalization would allow the firms to collect huge amounts of data, and also the evolution of computation would allow processing this data, but still the human beings would be limited in dealing with this information overload. So attention would be the most important scarcity in the 21st century, and that's the point that what we see now. So the idea is not new, but the problem of information overload is something that it's not, it's an increasing problem. It's not so recent, but it's every year more important. Next, how to profit from attention. So if attention is so scarce, and maybe there is a value associated to attention, so how to profit from it. And then I will link this to multi-sided platform. And the theoretical lens to understand multi-sided platform are relatively new. So 17 years ago, we had the publication of this article by Rocher and Tirole. And of course, multi-sided platform, they existed for centuries. Any stock market, for instance, is a multi-sided platform. But the way of understanding and designing proper strategies and designing proper pricing is something that is relatively new. And this is not about digital platforms necessarily. So it's very common in digital platforms. And it's also not restricted to attention. So let's see, let's move more to the strategy to generate values in platforms, and the idea is to get deeper in the problem of attention. So when you have a platform, so you have this two-sided or more sides of the market, and you observe network externality from one side to the other side. So this could be a short definition for a platform. And there are at least 3 mechanisms to generate value. And one is, we know with several examples, is a matchmaker. Is just the idea of reducing the transaction cost of the interaction of a buyer and a seller. So this is the case of eBay, not in the area of business, but in the area of love affairs. We may have matching clubs also, so it's always reducing the cost of connecting, like in the case of Uber, connecting drivers and passengers. And that's the way of generating or creating value. The other case is, the other mechanism is the idea of cost sharers. So instead of every supplier or every seller having to provide a device for the transmission of his product, may share the same console, the same device for dozens and hundreds of suppliers. So the game industry may use PlayStation as a single platform, and then the costs share. The same thing we could say about iPhone. And then we come to the third one, which is assembling eyeballs. And the idea of assembling eyeballs is exactly extracting value from attention. So here is the point that's interest for today. And we have the case of Google. I would put Facebook here, of course, but it's interesting to see that a single platform may operate with more than one mechanism to generate value. And I would say that Facebook actually, sometimes they are cost sharers in the sense to have a single platform for several developers. They may operate also in matchmakers, at least as extending functionalities that they have today, and assembling eyeballs. And Globo, it's a Brazilian, very well-known TV, and we see this. So the intention to write Globo as an example here is just to be clear that it's not about digital platforms necessarily. So we may have platforms that are not digital. So let's get deeper in this third point. So how to generate value from attention. I'll go fast here, but because I think it's a straightforward idea. So the first is, of course, you are paying attention to something like your Facebook page, and then there is a ad in the side. So you are distracted by the ad. You are receiving information, a message from a seller. Maybe something more explicit, like an ad that's inserted in the middle of the video that you are watching in Facebook. So very explicit. You have to stop seeing your video and have to see the ad in Facebook, or maybe even subliminal. So it's inside the video that you are Forrest Gump. So there are plenty of products that are there, and of course this is very much articulated between companies and the producers of the film. Also, there is the case of an environment that people are they are exposed to messages, like if you walk in a shopping center, you are exposed to several messages related to different sellers, and this is careful planned by the shopping center managers. And all these strategies, and my intention was not to give a comprehensive set of strategies, so these are examples. They follow a principle of value creation. And the first idea of this principle is that the more scarce is cognition, or if you will, the more we have information overload. So cognition, the use of cognition is more is scarce. Then the value of directing attention towards a message will be greater, will be higher. So this is one principle. The second is, the better the matching between the message and the target audience, so the higher will be the probability of a newer transaction to occur. So if you have a better matching, then newer transactions will occur. And my assumption here, and this is a little bit different from John's, is that in this case I will accept the idea of that value was created. So if the two sides they want to interact, so a buyer and a seller, this was good for the buyer. I acknowledge that there are limits on that buyers may be manipulated, but I would take this as an assumption that value is created. Let's move to the more controversial issue. So far is the straightforward idea of platforms and eyeball assembling, but let's move forward to things that I think I have something new to say. First, it's everything that we just said. It's really about the creation of social value. So I agree that there is the creation of private value, but is there a creation of social value? So let's talk first about the matchmaker and cost shares. It seems that in this case, it's really about the creation of a social value, because the two parts in the two parts, like a couple that meet at Tinder, it seems that they are happy about that. So all the participants in the platform are happier. In the case of cost shares, we are decreasing costs, so it seems that we are really creating a social value. But what about the case of assembling eyeballs or trying to extract value from attention? There's something different here, because in the core of the difference is that one side of the market is not choosing, it's just receiving. I will abstract from persuasion, manipulation. I acknowledge that they exist and they may be a problem, but I abstract from that. Let's take the case that if we have a successful transaction, value was created. Still, we have a lot of failed transactions. So we may receive messages that are consuming our very scarce attention. And this will not result in a transaction. So this will be a loss. So we have to account for the loss of failed transactions. So in what conditions this loss may be greater or not than the value that was created? First, this is very particular of this form of creating values is a seller's decision if they are going to address or trying to compete for attention of a specific consumer. I use this expression. So the seller wants something that is profitable. And what they may have in mind is if the expected benefit of competing for attention, so placing an ad, for instance, is greater than the cost of placing the ad, so it's a private cost and a private benefit, then it's profitable to compete for attention, and they go forward and they replace the ad. But socially, the things are different. In terms of social welfare, we have the private property it's a part of the social value, the social cost of the seller. So this S is for seller, and this B is for buyer. The guy they are competing for the attention. So there is a cost for the buyer. There is a cost for the buyer because attention is very scarce. I would like to use my attention the best way I could. Sometimes I don't want to be overwhelmed by messages. So this creates a loss to the consumer. So there is a social loss. And you can see that a lot of failed transactions, will occur. And moreover, we may have ads that are placed, so the company is deciding to compete for the attention, but the social welfare outcome is negative because of this component, right? Also, the higher this cost, so the higher the opportunity cost of using my attention, and this is very, very high nowadays, higher the social cost, all right? So I think there is an implication here for regulation, data protection. I will try to re-illustrate this in a pedestrian case, so it's anecdotal evidence of a personal experience. I bought an apartment 3 years ago, and my telephone number stayed in a database, and this was traded among real estate brokers. And there are thousands of real estate brokers in São Paulo, maybe more than 1,000 for sure. So I guess all estate broker in São Paulo have my cell phone number, and they call me all the time. They call me during the day. Sometimes I react, oh, you should not call me during work time. And then I realize, well, what time should the guy call me? At Saturday night or during the Sunday with the lunch with my family? Well, I would like to have more control over the the destination of my attention, and I'm being consumed by this competition for myself. By the way, I bought my apartment, so I will not buy another apartment so soon. So I received these messages of failed transactions that are cost to society, and this may be a case for regulation, and I'm a little bit skeptical about the data protection law to really be enforceable in a way to preclude this type of strategy. So I leave here a question to my good friend Roberto Pfeiffer, who was an authority in the area of consumer protection, and who is a prominent scholar in this area, to see what are the answer that we have in consumer protection and data protection law. Second point that I think it's controversial is about the big techs. And normally when we see this thing about competition for attention, we are talking about Google and Facebook and the big techs, and there is a fuzz about that. And the question I pose to myself here, should they receive a harsher treatment or not? Or a different treatment? Actually, first, the problem precedes big techs. It was for sure aggravated by the digital economy, but it's not specific to the big techs. And also it's related to information overload. So people having my phone number, a lot of people having my phone number, and I have a lot of information to process, so I don't have spare time. I want to use my attention properly, and I've been overwhelmed by several messages that they crowd out my ability to think and to process information. But what big techs they do, and some people complain, and this I think it's an overlap with John's talk, they use data to target ads. Is it good or bad? At least in this context, this is not bad. Take the case of the social laws that we had. When you target an ad, you use data in order to match more properly the message and the target audience, then the profit that is expected to derive from the action of trying to reach the consumer is higher, because you have the message is more likely to reach the right consumer. And also, the cost of receiving the message is also lower, because the ad is being targeted to a specific audience. So in that sense, it's good for the social welfare targeting ads. The worst case is ads with no target at all. So this, it doesn't seem to me a problem that big techs are using data in order to target advertisement. I do believe there are things that we have to think about in terms of regulating big tech, and so this is a whole issue that I think it's quite interesting to debate. But I don't think this is a problem in this market for competition, of competing for attention. And I finished with a link with John's presentation. And although I think there is room for regulation, and regulation, it could be a sort of a collective arrangements or cooperation among competitors in order to address the problem of externality. So this, I take the case of coordination among competitors. But also, I think it's important to have a competition among platforms. I still think it's crucial to have competition among platforms, because platforms, they internalize social laws, because otherwise they may lose consumers to other platforms that are abusing consumers in the way they transmit information. So my case was a case of very small real estate brokers they are not coordinating themselves, and they are not internalizing the cost of assessing me negatively. They just want one interaction with me, not more than one. So they don't see the future relationship with me. And so platforms have this benefit. But on the other hand, in order to really transfer to consumers this benefit, you have to have competition. Otherwise, this will not be transferred. So that's it. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Paulo. You did not plan, but you kind of presented a complimentary view about the attention, at least to my end. But without taking long, I will pass the floor to Rory. Rory, please.
Great, thanks. It's an honor to be participating in this conference, although I wish we were all together in Brazil, where I've been fortunate to spend almost a year of my life. You know, it's good. It makes sense that I'm going last on this panel, given my focus. So just yesterday, as John was mentioning, the US government announced that it would be seeking not only to prosecute Facebook under antitrust law, but to break it up. And so my central question that I'm going to focus on today is, what's the end game? So if an antitrust lawsuit is successful on, say, attention harm grounds, and the judge agrees with the government that Facebook, Google, or some other company has exercised monopoly power with respect to attention markets, what comes next? How do you fix that attention harm situation and context? Now, there are really two main, at least antitrust solutions that I envision. One is breaking a company up, and the second is forcing platforms to give more access to competitors who would then, in theory, seek the attention of users, perhaps with more respect or thoughtfulness, lower social costs. So the most criticized of all antitrust remedies by far is the breakup divestiture. The current chair of the US Federal Trade Commission, this was before sentiments changed perhaps, but stated that after Facebook and Instagram have integrated their systems following their merger, splitting up the two social networks becomes more difficult because it would be like unscrambling eggs. So it's like you mixed a bunch of eggs and then you want to separate out the yolk from the whites. The US Department of Justice antitrust chief under President Obama made a similar observation that it can be difficult or impossible to unscramble the eggs. And over decades, references to this breakfast plate have repeatedly appeared in official speeches, scholarly articles, and judicial rulings. So the egg scrambling metaphor is misguided. I believe businesses routinely break themselves up. More than 3,000 voluntary divestitures occur each year. So that's about, to give you a relative sense, you know, there are 3,000 voluntary divestitures, and those comprise about a third of all mergers and acquisitions. So it's debatable whether or not a divestiture should be counted as a merger and acquisition, but if you do, it'd be about a third of them. So that's a lot of the deals that take place each year are actually divestitures. Many are enormous. So not that long ago, Hewlett-Packard split itself down the middle and created two roughly equal companies, each of which was one of the largest 100 companies in the United States by value. Last year, Fox sold its movie business to Disney for $71 million, and those are two companies that, you know, to points made in both of the prior presentations, would operate in attention markets and increasingly compete with online companies like Netflix. All right, so in other words, well, most of the government and academia see breakups as radical and extreme, leading business executives and others see them as a standard part of corporate governance. So business scholars, if we were all business scholars, not law scholars, the idea of a divestiture would just be kind of normal, right? It's only because we're thinking from an antitrust lens that all of a sudden becomes some like exotic animal, almost a unicorn in US antitrust history, at least over the past few decades. So, all right, if this seemingly harmless metaphor is so pervasive, we have to ask ourselves what's going on with the end game in antitrust and what the implications are for attention markets. So I believe it expresses a potentially devastating worldview. And that worldview helps to explain why the government has not broken up any of the largest US companies since 1984. So that's when the Department of Justice, for which I guess you probably are all aware, John Newman used to work for, split the, not at the time though, not in 1984, split up the AT&T monopoly into 7 pieces. And that move was widely celebrated, especially by consumers who are paying over $8 for a 5-minute call from Washington, D.C., who at the time were paying that amount for a call from Washington, D.C. to New York. And even many left-leaning, so progressive, more pro-regulation intellectuals calling for more aggressive antitrust enforcement in the United States, and who are also calling for splitting up big tech companies due to Breakup's perceived messiness, prefer not to break up companies like Facebook, or at least have traditionally, especially even up to, say, a few months back. Instead, they prefer that second option that I mentioned at the beginning, access remedies. Access remedies would leave the monopoly in place, but require it to help competitors, if you will. So rather than forcing Facebook to divest its previous acquisitions, Instagram and WhatsApp, the social network could be required to allow users to transfer their accounts or post simultaneously to other social networks. So some critiques of AT&T's dissolution emphasize that a better solution would have been to, say, mandate that AT&T allow competitors to use its telephone network. Now, one clear problem with access remedies in attention markets is that they're unlikely to deter anti-competitive behavior. At trial, companies almost always fight for something other than breakups. Weaker remedies give CEOs incentives to build attention monopolies. And equally problematic is that these other remedies are extremely expensive and difficult to administer. So, for example, requiring Amazon to share its platform fairly with competitors, or Amazon or Facebook doing the same, with say third-party either social networks or app developers that it didn't want to. That would require extensive ongoing monitoring by the government, or at least dispute resolution apparatus for when these now supposedly no longer banned attention merchants were unhappy with what Facebook was doing. So access remedies require this ongoing oversight, sophistication, and dispute resolution mechanisms that are typically beyond the capabilities of antitrust agencies. That's not what antitrust agencies do well, right? So in the most recent large-scale case that included remedies along these lines, so that was the Microsoft case in the United States, courts were involved for 16 years. And one of the biggest critiques of breakups is that courts are involved for so long. So a similar narrative of administrative messiness can be crafted about access remedies as exists for breakups. Now, in contrast, breakups are cleaner and cheaper in attention markets because they provide a kind of one-off event after which the government can move on. Now, by instead pushing antitrust toward really what are government-heavy remedies, that resistance to breakups leaves antitrust with only unattractive options. Unattractive remedies means enforcers are less likely to take any action at all. And that's potentially extra difficult in attention markets because I think a lot of people, quite frankly, just don't realize, even though I agree with John that the data does support a lot of the inferences of harm, making bad decisions as a result, or behavioral outbursts. And by the way, I would be, I like the idea of being able to blame my misbehavior on Facebook. I think a lot of people just don't recognize that connection, right? And so a lot of people aren't going to realize that they need the harm, and faced with bad remedies, if that's how we perceive them, I think a lot of people might just say, well, just leave me with the attention harms that Facebook is imposing rather than pursuing a breakup where these bad things may happen, disrupted service or whatever it may be. So in other words, the animosity toward breakups has made the very institution of antitrust in America weak, feeble. Of course, will breakups of Facebook and Instagram or Google and Waze, which also, Waze is a driving app that Google purchased, and that's another sphere of attention. How do you get from point A to point B, and so on? There are limits to how much. So those breakups may make sense, but there are limits to how much some of these tech companies can be carved up without harming consumers. And antitrust breakups involve considerable costs in executing reorganization. So as a result, some caution is appropriate for sure in choosing breakups as a remedy, and access mandates have a place in the antitrust arsenal for attention markets. It would be a mistake to launch into an indiscriminate breakup rampage of all concentrated attention markets and hope that fixes the problems. But in weighing these costs, authorities should recognize that even private divestitures require tremendous organizational expenses. So the key in both public and private breakups is not to let the inevitable reorganization costs prevent economic progress, right? So in 1911, John D. Rockefeller argued, or rather his lawyers argued really, that breaking up his oil monopoly would not only be dangerous to the industry, to the oil industry, but calamitous to shareholders. Similar arguments have been made before the AT&T breakup and other efforts by the government to break up companies. But Rockefeller's wealth, a lot of people don't know this, but his wealth reached its peak after the breakups. It skyrocketed, by some accounts tripled in the few years after the breakup, because now he owned stocks in all these other companies, Exxon and so on, that are now enormous oil companies. And AT&T's shareholders, at least those who held on to their shares, to their stock, they earned very high returns after the company broke up AT&T. And that's because buyers of broken up monopolies pay for the carved up pieces, and smaller, nimbler companies can better adapt to changing markets. And would also, in theory, then be better at adapting to, say, users or society's sense of these attention harms. And also, more importantly, in the context of attention markets, because one of the big issues is going to be innovation, and are we going to harm innovation by intervening? Nobody can deny that those U.S. industries, oil and telecommunications, in the case of AT&T, they subsequently flourished, right? They led the world. U.S. Industries led the world in those areas, despite the breakup of the biggest company in the U.S. So the lowest cost intervention, if cost is narrowly defined as the expenditures that the government exerts, will always be to do nothing and then hopes that markets will dislodge the monopoly, such as through disruptive innovation. Now, in attention markets, that's, in some ways potentially even more seductive of a solution, this potential for organic disruption, because you have TikTok, you have these other companies that can spring up and all of a sudden be vying for people's attention. And that has some appeal. At the same time, we can't be assured that a disruption is right around the corner. Now, the topic of innovation, just to drill down on this because it's so important in attention markets, is very, I would say, dysfunctional, convoluted in antitrust law. So U.S. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia said the opportunity to, this is a quote from one of his majority briefs, the opportunity to charge monopoly prices, at least for a shorter period or a short period of time, is what attracts business acumen in the first place. It induces risk-taking that produces innovation and economic growth. To safeguard the incentive to innovate, the possession of monopoly power will not be found unlawful unless it is accompanied by an element of anti-competitive conduct. And so, and often the conduct that is deemed to be wrong needs to be linked to the remedy. So that would suggest that perhaps the only way to remedy attention harms is either to go back to a prior merger, like Instagram, the purchase of Instagram, or to find something that closely links to the kind of attention, whatever conduct is seen as anti-competitive with respect to attention. And in some cases, that's not going to be a breakup. So that creates a problem if you believe that reasoning by Scalia, or that Scalia, really kind of synthesized from the field. Now, you can't deny that that there's importance in protecting innovation from a societal and economic standpoint. Many see it as the leading, if not the only, reason that we shouldn't do breakups. And in particular, the fear, to make it just more succinct, is that we don't want to discourage entrepreneurs from starting up a company. Now, protecting innovation, in my mind, doesn't mean that we have to avoid breakups. In light of what breakups can accomplish as a remedy, innovation concerns don't support the current permissiveness of success-driven monopolies, because to assess that concern, we need to emphasize, or at least recognize, that breaking up an organic monopoly does not just happen in a way that completely destroys all of the success and the benefits of these attention markets, right? When a company is asked to divest, the shareholders benefit from whatever sale is imposed. And so that means that the breakup could unfold in a way that would offer those who built the company sufficient rewards for their innovation. So to illustrate, consider how this might unfold with, say, Google or Facebook. If Facebook were split into several companies, say separated from WhatsApp and Instagram, so founder CEO Mark Zuckerberg would still own stakes in an enormous company. Whatever company was left over would still be probably one of the 10 largest after it was separated from Instagram. Definitely one of the 100 largest. But anyhow, an enormous company would still result that Zuckerberg would lead. And he, like John Rockefeller, Zuckerberg would surely still be one of the wealthiest people in the world. And at that point, it's hard to imagine that, young or old entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs of any age would, I say young because Zuckerberg was really young when he did that, but it's hard to imagine they would say, oh, we don't want to we don't want to follow in Zuckerberg's path, because one day we might end up one of the richest people in the world, still the head of an incredibly large company. You know, like that just doesn't compute that would somehow deter people from pursuing a similar path. Nor, on the other hand, does it imply or mean that they would, all of a sudden, the existing companies out there might start to refrain from building an attention empire, right? So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword in that regard, but what this means is that we shouldn't hesitate to break up a monopoly because we're worried about innovation. And that's important, again, for attention markets. In the end, neither access nor divestiture remedies are perfect. You know, due to network effects and attention markets, even the remaining broken up companies are going to be incredibly concentrated. And, you know, no remaining kind of remedy would be able to act on its own, right? And so you almost need a combination of remedies that would probably draw from both traditional antitrust remedies and regulation outside of antitrust, or what's traditionally associated with remedies outside of trust, because antitrust in the US at least operates on more of an equity basis. It's kind of hard to say this is or isn't, you know, officially an antitrust remedy, but it's probably what attention markets need, in short, is some kind of combination of remedies rather than just say one approach. In closing, we should probably start thinking of antitrust in attention markets more like firefighting rather than this misguided egg metaphor. So the Forest Service regularly manages controlled burns, right? They go out and they burn parts of the forest, which prevent catastrophic wildfires and enable attention ecosystems to thrive, or could, in theory, enable attention ecosystems to thrive. And occasional breakups that have costs in the short term can help make attention markets healthier in the long run. The harms to our economy, our attention, perhaps our relationships and mental health from large attention monopolies are far more certain than the speculative fears of messy breakups. So again, thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to the remaining discussion.
I thank you very much for this really complete, I would say, assessment of what is going on in the world from the US and outside the US. I mean, you happen to make a very straightforward, I would say, but very complete. Congratulations. Thank you very much. I learned. It's a way to explain it faster. We have some questions from the audience, and I have other questions from my end, but I will pass the word to Professor Roberto Pfeiffer, and then I can present the questions and we can debate a little bit. Okay, thank you very much.
So good evening. I'm extremely grateful for the invitation to participate in the third International Conference on Competition Innovation. Once again, very well organized by Professors Eduardo Gaban and Vinicius Klein. It's a great honor to be present at this panel. Professor Paulo Furquim is a very good friend, and I'm always happy to share events with him. I'm a reader of Professor John Newman's essays, especially the articles Antitrust in Zero Price Markets Foundations and Antitrust in Attention Markets, precisely the topic addressed in our panel. It's also a great pleasure to be with Professor Rory Van Loo, with several articles on digital platforms, competition law, and consumer law fields, which coincides with my areas of interest. As a debater, I will make some general comments and with a few questions to the three excellent speakers. The first theme that I would like to point out is that attention markets are closely related to technology and infrastructure. a field that has been subject to disruptive changes. Innovation starts like an invention within a process close to Schumpeter's creative destruction. If we think, for example, about the invention and development of industries like printed newspaper, radio, television, and internet, the new means of capturing attention began to be used by a few enthusiasts, followed by mainstream firms, and then the market has been dominated by oligopolistic firms with significant market power. Chin Wu books, The Master Switch and Attention Merchants, portray very well and warm of this kind of pattern. In other words, the oligopolist firms dominating a new technology, and warm of the pattern occurring in relation to the internet and digital markets. Another point is scarcity. It's really true, and Professors John Newman and Paulo Furquim highlight the scarcity of our attention. The scarcity is related with the lack of time, but also of the lack of the capacity, the human capacity to process information and to make attention to many things. John Herbert Simon is a good example of this kind of restriction. And another point that I would like to highlight is the problem of there are many and so many kinds of business. I highlight, for example, there are streaming platforms of music, films, and series. It's an example of Spotify, Netflix, and Global Play. In this case, the business model is based not only on charging consumers a fee, but also with advertising revenue and with the processing of personal data provided by customers. There are other business models typical of non-price markets, a topic so well discussed by Professor Newman, such as social networks like Facebook, that was at the center of the speech of Professor Rory, with emphasis on LinkedIn and Facebook, and internet search engines like Google. In this case, there is no charge for a monetary value as a fee from the consumer. However, the remuneration is due to advertising and personal data collection and processing. So the advertiser and the consumption of time with the advertisement is a very important issue in the attention markets, as well as the persuasive kindness of act of because the persuasion is at the aim of the advertising industries, and the advertiser could persuade not only to buy some things, but as well as to the conduct of the consumers. So it's a key issue, the quantity and the kind of publicity. I truly, I really agree with Professor Newman that there could not be a relevant market definition that would cover all markets for attention. In other words, attention marks could not be defined as a relevant market. Such hypothesis would lead to markets with so many companies and that it would be difficult to conclude that any of them has market power. And the conclusion that GAFAM companies lack economic power is not correct at all. On the other hand, there are several adaptations in competition law enforcement that seem to be necessary to handle with this kind of attention market, especially those related with no price or zero price markets. Indeed, price is a central issue in the design of antitrust tools. So competition authorities have great difficulties in dealing with issues related to quality or others issues not related to price. Competition must be concerned with such markets because it's not true that they provide free goods and service. Indeed, there is remuneration by consumers, even if not monetary, for example, through attention and data. The companies earn very high advertised revenue. So there should have an emphasis on this side of the markets. I can also point some common characteristics. But I start with a disagreement between Professors Paulo Furquim and John Newman about the possibility to classify the attention marks companies as act in multi-sided or two-sided markets. But in any case, many attention companies benefit from network externalities, economies of scale, and low marginal costs that normally, these are some reasons to have so concentrated markets. And there are also reasons for the concern with digital platforms. Advertising is a very important source of remuneration. And one very important issue is the persuasive power of advertising. And so the kind of publicity is something inherent of the quality or the costs of the service. And they collect and process consumers' personal data intensively. Thus, they are big data monetizers. At this point, I would like to dialogue with the presentation of Professor Newman. I totally agree with him that attention would demand a much more intensive concern, whether from the doctrine or from the competition authorities. I also agree with him that there is a disproportionate concern in the debate about the impact of attention markets in relation to the intensive discussion of the role of antitrust policy for the protection of personal data. But on the other hand, I understand that there is a lot of synergy with the issue of protection of personal data and attention markets, because the advertisement is benefits of inference that the companies can get of the data. For example, the target advertising or the personally advertising is rich, and the service provides a perfect and with the data. So, in my opinion, the ideal is that the efforts and emphasis should come together. The efforts on and the emphasis on data protection could come together with the efforts on attention markets peculiarities. With this observation, I ask the following questions to the speakers. The first question is that if they agree with Professor Newman, and my opinion is that it's correct that the attention market cannot be defined as an specific relevant market. The second question is concerning about adaptations of the necessary antitrust tools to correctly face the challenge of the attention markets, such as, for example, the hypothetical monopolist test in a non-price market, and the questions of quality and costs to appreciate the effects of a merger. And as Professor Rory broke us the debate about remedies, I would like to have the opinion of Professors Paulo Furquim and Professor John Newman about the breakup remedy. And the last question is do the speakers agree with that attention market is closely related to the use of personal data by platforms that dispute the attention of consumers in several relevant markets, and if they agree that these two kind of new themes could be bring together. For example, in a merger review, the competition authority must be must be concerned with the quality, and the quality could be the more or less invasive form of privacy, and possible increase in time, quantity, and direct and target advertising. So I would like so much this opportunity to be here, and I get the floor to Eduardo.
All right, Roberto, thank you very much. As you started the provocations already, I will enjoy this opportunity to add 4 more, and then we can go over. I'm sure the professors are very smart, and so they have answers for each one of the questions we are going to present. So the first question is from the audience. Actually, Professor Aloysio Miele, one of the IBCI directors and co-organizers of this huge event. Of course, I mean Professor Klein is, but we have like 10 or more people working to make it possible. Okay, so everyone is responsible for this. So the first question is to Professor John. I will go over the 4 questions, and then we will hear you. Is your analysis of attention as the product of a digital market restricted to social media, or a little broader? So another question that I have. In case we all agree about the existence of a market for attention, let's say we do agree there is a market for attention. Shall we, or should we also consider also a market for consumer consent? Or going a little further, I would also ask or consider, why not considering a market for personal data on consumers' end? I mean, in a way that the consumer, myself, could sell my own personal data. The second question. And I later tell you what I think, okay? Not now. What sort of regulation, in your opinion, would be recommended to temper the exact level of acceptable consumer attention? In relation to what the personal experience Paulo shared with us, and I live it every day. You know, it's insane. This is a harm we should consider. I'm not sure if it's antitrust, but it is a harm indeed. And the last one, assuming the antitrust should care about the process of competition, right? Forgetting the discussion of the hipster, you know, we should care about the process, level playing field only, rather than anything else. Let's take this premise, okay? Should it focus in friend conditions in relation to the ecosystems rather than any other exotic remedy? Okay, guys, the word is yours.
John first.
All right. Thank you so much for these. I was just trying to jot them all down to make sure I had them all. I'm going to try to just do a run by and see if I can hit all of them. I'm sure I'm going to miss a few. Starting with, I think, Roberto, this was one of your questions. And it's really about tools, right? It's, can we apply the hypothetical monopolist test, for instance, to an attention market? I think so in theory. I think you could ask, well, would a hypothetical monopolist in an attention market use its power to extract more attention than would be extracted in a competitive market? That's the hypothetical monopolist test. So in theory, I think it works. In practice, I think it would be quite difficult. And I'm not sure it's the right question that we should be asking. You know, it's one thing to talk about imaginary companies, a hypothetical monopolist, in a market where we're already pretty familiar with the market itself. But in markets like these, where there's already a lot of complexity and some uncertainty, to then add in an imaginary firm and start asking what it would do in this imaginary world, it seems like we're starting to maybe ask the wrong question. So I don't think it's necessary to apply the test, to come up with a market definition that makes sense. As to the sort of interplay between data and attention, I think that's an interesting question. I think to some extent they're similar. They're both things that we can trade in exchange for something we value. But my sense from reading some of the empirical studies that are out there is that people respond much more strongly to changes in attention load than they do to changes in privacy settings. That is, if Facebook suddenly does some horrible new privacy practice, we all yell about it for a week and everybody says, oh, I'm going to quit Facebook and quit Instagram, and nobody does. But when companies start trying to display too many ads, they find that people do actually switch away very quickly. So my sense is that competition then will be stronger around attention if we can allow it to flourish. Whereas I'm less convinced, although there's some evidence that shows this too, I'm less convinced that people will vie for high privacy settings and that users will respond well. I think though that there are some, like you said, some complementarities there. And I think competition does work to some extent for both. I think we're all talking about more than just social media. I think at the very least, it seems like online search is delivered in what could be thought of as an attention market. And really anytime you see people trading attention, that's the key, right? Is that part of the contract? I am giving up this valuable thing in exchange for your valuable thing. Now that makes this different from when, I would say Paulo's example of a telemarketer with no consent on my part, just calling me. You know, I don't know if I would think of that so much as market activity. There's not a voluntary exchange there, unless Paulo likes, you know, getting the calls and maybe puts up a sign that says, please call me on his window. But I doubt he's done that. So then moving down our list here, how do we arrive then at the right level of attention extraction in markets where it's voluntary, right? And that's a different question from just getting a telemarketer call. You know, I think that's tough. I think one way to do it though, aside from breakups, right? Rory's solution, which I think is a good one in some cases, we might look for practices that are particularly likely to create addiction, right? Almost an addictive response from users, and say, you know, there are some designs, the infinitely scrolling feed, right, is one that some people have said, maybe we should just prohibit that. Like, you can no longer have an infinitely scrolling feed. That would be a way to, I'm not saying that's the best way, but that would be a way to sort of dial back the level of attention. It's targeted at a particularly, you know, almost addictive style of feature. So that, rather maybe than something like Frand, would be maybe my preferred solution. Of course, it would require a lot of study to figure out exactly which practices should be prohibited and how, but that would be my preferred way.
Okay, so I'll try to answer all the questions, maybe like 8 questions in like 2 or 3 answers. Well, it's complicated to do that, but I'll try to do for the sake of the audience and of the timing. First, I completely agree with John and Roberto that there is not a relevant market for attention for everything. The first thing you have to ask is attention of who? So the point is to have a message that is effective in targeting a specific consumer. So that consumer is not watching everything at the same time. There's not that kind of thing. So it doesn't make sense. Also, I would not subscribe the expression, actually, in this point I may diverge, of the expression of market of attention. And I think this exactly for the reason that John just mentioned. So it's not, I think the rule of the competition for attention, that I think it's a perfect statement. The competition for attention is that I do not put on the market my attention. I cannot assign property rights to my attention and have my attention being subject to trade. I can do that for data, for instance. We may assign property rights to data, but not for attention. What I think happens is when you have a platform, they explore the externality of attention. They are able to create value using the externality in a way to have a transaction. That's at least my view of the subject. And for this reason, we can put everything that is competition for attention under the same framework of analysis. So the telemarketing or Facebook, of course, in the platform, I choose to be subject to extraction of my attention. In other case, I cannot do that. So I'm bullied by others, but they can do that. I cannot exclude them for doing that. I can, because of the data privacy law, I can exclude them of having my phone number, but not for stopping me on the street or to having an outdoor on the street and I receive that message. Regarding remedies, and I think this is the most controversial issue here, and we have a lot to talk about. And Rory was very careful in developing his idea. I will subscribe completely one of his sentences. It was, we should not be worried about breaking up companies because of harm to innovation. I entirely agree with that. I would add, we should not worry about breaking up companies if the outcome of breaking up companies is something that is increasing competition and the outcome for society is better. And so we had a case in Brazil in the cartel of the cement industry, and the decision by CADE was breaking up companies. And I was not there at the time, but I was enthusiastic about the decision that really addressed the problem that caused the cartel. But I'm not enthusiastic about breaking up tech companies for two reasons. One is more straightforward. The reasons that we have huge companies in this area are several, but I will highlight network externalities that are very impressive and very low marginal costs or economies of scale. And for these reasons, they have for structurally a drive for increasing, for becoming almost monopoly, if not differentiated. And this if is very important. If they are like a homogeneous product, it would be like a monopoly. But if they have differentiation, we may have more than one competing. And if we break up the companies and this structural feature is still there, what we expect is one of them will start to increase and grow and profiting from network externalities and economies of scale. Will be more competitive, and then at the end of the day we'll have again the problem. So you have to break up companies again. Maybe you have to break up companies recurrently. But there is a second reason. I think this is less common to see in economics, is more common to see in strategy. So the value of the assets of the company, the most important assets of the company, normally are not the tangible assets, are not facilities, are intangible assets, like a capability of doing something. And this is very difficult for an authority, so a competition authority, to understand, to process, and to disentangle the capabilities properly. You may not only harm the capabilities, but you may not divide properly because you don't know so well. They are, by one of the definitions of these intangible assets and capabilities, they are typically tacit knowledge. So we cannot write exactly what they are. So it's difficult to separate them. For exactly the same reason, in talking about remedies, I do think that we do have remedies and we need remedies in terms of competition policy. And exactly for the same reason, I think we should be much more restrictive regarding mergers. When we have a merger, we have two different capabilities, and they may be able to compete by differentiation, by innovation. And if allow these companies to flourish, maybe we have a competitive pressure that is interesting. And the second point is, it's about competition, but it's not on the domain of the competition authorities. It's the domain of regulatory authorities. It's a pro-competitive regulation. And I give you an example that fits well in the matchmaker market, so payment systems, but not in the attention, in the platforms that are exploring attention. What we have in Brazil is a very well succeeded experience in regulation. To be brief, there are two systems of regulations. One for dominant position companies, so if they have more than 20% of a market, and lower than 20% of a market. And actually, there is a threshold more in terms of the volume they trade, not this 20%, but it is an approximation. If you don't have dominant position, you can do whatever you want in terms of the business model. You may use closed systems that you do not share anything. But if you are in a dominant position, you have to share. You have to operate in an open system. Everyone has the right to operate your system. And this is a quite successful empirical evidence that we have in Brazil. So fintech industry, they are flourishing in a market that was very where the lack of competition was very clear. So the financial system in Brazil lacked competition. I think this is very clear. And these fintech companies, they are flourishing in really now having a competitive pressure on banks. So I think I finish here. There are all the questions I know, but I think I spoke too much already.
Not at all. It was nice. Rory?
Yeah, all right. So I'm just going to take a few of these questions. First, on the notice and the notice question or consent market possibility, I think notice and consent is just broken. You know, there's this fiction that we've all agreed to the terms that Facebook or any of these platforms offer when we sign up. It's a legal fiction, at least. And I think that the flaws with that model would apply to whatever replacement market we might devise that would allow people to potentially sell their attention or their production capabilities, depending on how we term it. So at the same time, you know, so I'm skeptical that it would work. At the same time, I'm kind of optimistic that, or I think it's worth trying things. You know, we're at a place where we just, things aren't working, and part of me says that we just need to try new things. You know, and but if we did that, we'd need to address the information overload and information asymmetries that would inevitably almost pervade those kinds of transactions. You know, and there are also some complex economic implications, right? So the standard response to this kind of proposal is that if we started requiring, say, Facebook or other attention platforms, if you will, to pay people for their time or to give them a cut of the marketing advertising, then that would raise the cost of advertising, and that would then get passed on to consumers indirectly because the companies that are paying the advertisers would need to raise prices, right? And so, and then that would have potentially unpredictable and perverse distributional implications. And so you need to also keep an eye on whether or not that kind of solution might exacerbate income inequality or consumption inequality at the very least. So on the question of regulations to get the right level of attention and how do we do that, how do we design that, that gets really tricky. I think my sense is in legal scholarship is people tend to much more want to talk about the problem and ways that we can fix the law to identify the problem, to prosecute the company for wrongdoing, and want to pay a lot less attention to the, you know, how exactly do you design the intervention, right? And with respect to attention markets, it's extra challenging to go outside of antitrust because we would need some kind of a government entity to, as the question kind of expresses, to establish the right level of attention that the consumer can give, or the right types of perhaps information that would be shared with the consumer. And that starts to get into a slippery slope that could bring us to a big brother type world, right? And so we might need the kind of private regulation, almost private procedural interventions like the Facebook Supreme Court, right? So for those who aren't aware, Facebook set up this independent Supreme Court, and it's staffed by private individuals who don't work directly for Facebook. It's funded by an independent budget, and it has the ability to kind of overturn Facebook decisions. So you can start to imagine potential solutions like that that wouldn't make it so that the government's establishing these attention guidelines, but still you'd have some entity that isn't the platform benefiting from it that would be calling the shots. And then finally, to Professor Paulo's concern about breakups, because we just have another company grow and kind of take the place of that company that we broke up before. And I think there's a lot to that. And I agree that some companies just can't be divided, right? Like, I don't know how you would apply breakups to Facebook after you get rid of Instagram and WhatsApp. So yes, there's limits. There's institutional limits in the tech sector in particular, and at the same time, you don't know what's going to happen until you try it, right? And if we have more fluctuation in terms of the participants in an industry as a result of breakups, companies competing to get that high market share after the breakup would at least have some extra motivations to treat consumers in a more dignified or attention respecting way, right? And so we may, as a result, have, at least until they get up to the monopoly status, the previous monopoly status. And that means that we might have, even if you had to go through the cycle of, break up and then slowly the market share goes back up, you still might have overall longer periods of history, future history, say half the time or 2/3 the time, who knows, until they get back up to that place, in which you have kind of better competition. And so even if you're right about you just be in the same situation before, there's a question of, is a cycle better than just steady state, defer to monopolies on an ongoing basis? And also there's a deterrence and incentive component here that's worth paying attention to, by which I mean, if you have a breakup and then you have this one company that's starting to get market share and it's rising and it gets to a high level, it might be sitting there saying, wow, we looked at what happened to Mark Zuckerberg and all the mistakes Facebook made. Maybe we should try to avoid doing the things that piss people off. And as a result, you may, even with the same exact market share as, say, Facebook had pre-breakup, you might actually find that you're in a better world, a post-breakup market that's better for consumers and respects their attention.
Yeah, I would add to this. To me, it seems like the ecosystem, digital ecosystems. They if they do not hold, they are very close to hold properties of natural monopolies rather than monopolies. So why don't we break up natural monopolies? Because we don't have anything to place there, right?
Yeah, which is one of the reasons why, if we're talking about alternative interventions, one of the ones that's thrown out there a lot is like, let's treat these companies like utilities, right? Mm-hmm. Like you would the electricity company or whatever. And that means a whole separate regulation oversight, right? But the challenge is, though, that's not as feasible when you're talking about speech.
The trade-off is not nice, at least does not look. We cannot foresee like a good trade-off, I mean, many things to be lost. Roberto, anything to say, my friend? I think we should go around for our concluding remarks. We are close to our time. I would start. We have another question. I think we can. Let's see here. Okay. I think we cannot. It's a huge question. Well, I would start from myself. Thank you again, Professor John, Professor Paulo, Professor Rory, Professor Roberto. It was a delightful panel to me. I'm really honored to be part of it, to address my question directly to you and to represent the audience here. It's a unique position. I would emphasize how glad I am, and thank you for your time. To distinguish IBCI with your presence, and I wish we can repeat in the future, maybe in presence, after this nightmare is end. Okay, so thank you very much, and please your concluding remarks.
Well, I want to first just echo, Eduardo, your thanks. Thank you so much to Roberto, to Paulo, to Rory for the comments and questions, and to the audience. These were wonderful. It's like I said in my affirmative sort of remarks, there just really hasn't been a conversation around this topic of attention, and starting from the economics, right, with Paulo, all the way through to the remedies with Rory. This was a delight. And really, I think, like I said, one of the first, if not the first, antitrust or competition panels that have to do with attention. So I want to thank, of course, IBCI for inviting us and putting this together. So thank you all. It was a real pleasure.
My turn. Well, thanks again for the invitation, Eduardo and Vinicius. I was happy about the invitation before the panel. Now I'm even happier after the panel. I really enjoy it very much. So I thank John and Rory and Roberto for their interventions. I learned a lot. I think it was inspiring. And so thank you and take care.
Right. I'm grateful to the organizers for their time spent bringing us all together, and to the participants, including the audience members, with their fantastic questions. And it was just such a generative session. And of course to John for kind of really in some ways like forging this subfield, if you will, in antitrust. And as this was super fun too, I should just say. And as the United States government continues to prosecute Facebook, I guess, given all of these sub-issues involved, we should all, get out our popcorn and sit back and kind of enjoy the show that's coming.
I think it's my turn. I would like to thank the organizers, and I would like us to thank Professor John, Professor Paulo, Professor Rory for the very instigant presentation. And I'm very, very happy tonight, and I'm very inspired to think about and to write about attention and the relation with data. So thank you so much.
Right, guys, was perfect. Thank you very much again.